Hello, our dear listeners. Wishing you a great day. Back to the developments of our story. After days and months of relentless searching, James has finally found Diep. But on the drive bringing her back, little did they know a quiet, ruthless net had been personally laid out by Chairman Juan right at the cabin. Will James's final bombshell, "Dad, you're going to be a grandfather," and Diep's fierce pushback be enough to turn the tables? Hold your breath and tune in to the heart-pounding events of today's episode with me right now. On the top floor of the corporate headquarters tower, where the entire bustling city under the evening glow could be taken in at a glance, the air was drowning in a suffocating, chilling silence. Chairman Juan's office had no lights on. The only light source was the crimson streaks of the late afternoon sun spilling through the floor-to-ceiling glass, casting his tall, imposing silhouette onto the quiet wool carpet. Assistant Tran stood exactly 3 paces from the desk. His head was bowed, beads of sweat still dotting his forehead, his face showing extreme tension. "Mr. Chairman," Assistant Tran spoke, his dry voice echoing clearly. Director James abruptly turned off all his phones yesterday afternoon. Last night, he was completely absent from the reception for the corporation's strategic partners. He swallowed hard, emphasizing the gravity of the situation. "Most importantly, we have a crucial board of directors meeting coming up to decide the direction for the next quarter. But right now, from his private secretary to his driver, no one can reach the director. It's like he just vanished from the city." He looked up, asking hesitantly, "Chairman, should we immediately send people out to find the director? And where should we even start looking, sir?" Standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, Chairman Juan had his hands clasped behind his back. He wore an ash-gray suit, his posture perfectly straight. Hearing the report about his son abandoning both partners and an important meeting, he didn't turn around immediately. His eyes leisurely looked down at the tiny stream of cars on the street below. After a moment, Chairman Juan slowly turned around, taking measured steps toward his desk. The corners of his mouth, marked with deep wrinkles, curled up slightly, forming a cold smirk. "No need," Chairman Juan said. His voice was deep and calm, yet carried a terrifyingly oppressive weight. "James is smart, but his nature is far too sentimental. Hit that fatal weakness, and no matter how brilliant a CEO he is, he's just a predictable child." He walked slowly toward his imposing leather chair, settled into it, and tapped his fingers rhythmically against the oak desk. Tap, tap. For him to just drop his work like that, destroying so much effort put into the corporation right now, there can only be one reason. He went looking for that girl. Assistant Tran looked up slightly, frowning in confusion. "But Mr. Chairman, according to the financial reports, Director James hasn't made any suspicious cash withdrawals or real estate purchases lately that would give us a clue. Even if he found her, where would he hide her?" Chairman Juan let out a low chuckle. The laugh carried a deep, biting mockery aimed at his own flesh and blood. "Do you think he's naive enough to use company accounts for me to track?" He shook his head, a terrifyingly sharp glint in his eyes. He quietly set up an anonymous offshore fund, using someone else's name to buy up that entire empty hill in the suburbs where she lives. Assistant Tran's eyes widened in shock. Chairman Juan slowly set his wineglass down. The clink of the glass base against the table let out a dry, sharp sound. But he forgot one thing. How could a massive, unusually clean stream of money suddenly pouring into a remote countryside escape my notice? Did he think just building a wooden house and hiding her there would create a safe haven completely off my radar? How ridiculous. He slowly stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with absolute composure. "Get the car ready, Tran," Chairman Juan ordered, his tone as casual as if he were going for a stroll. "I will personally head down to that tea hill. and see how my son built this little love nest of his." Twilight was gradually falling. Hundreds of miles away from the city center, James's black SUV smoothly sliced through the wind, cruising down the highway. Outside, the last rays of the sun had faded entirely, giving way to the slowly descending night. The sky, clear and crisp after the rain, draped itself in the deep blue of early evening. A few early stars peeked out on the horizon, while the streetlights cast soft streaks of light that glided across the windshield. The scenery on both sides of the road retreated like a quiet, poetic, and incredibly peaceful movie. The atmosphere inside the cabin seemed to sync perfectly with the tranquility outside. The car glided effortlessly, leaving only the soft purr of the engine blending with a wordless jazz track on the radio, creating a wonderfully gentle and soothing vibe, as if softly comforting three people who had just walked out of a storm. In the back seat, Diep's mother had fallen into a deep sleep. All the worries of the past few weeks had etched deep lines at the corners of her eyes. But tonight, those wrinkles had relaxed. Seeing the burden lifted off Diep's shoulders, seeing James's broad back always ready to protect both mother and daughter, she felt truly at peace. She believed that as long as James and Diep were back together, all the storms out there would eventually pass. The smooth ride of the car right now was like a cradle, lulling her into a rare, peaceful sleep. In the passenger seat, Diep pulled the edge of her woolen blanket right up to her chin, curling up into a small ball. She couldn't sleep. Under the moonlight and the flickering streetlights passing over the window, Diep could clearly see the exhaustion on James's face. His square jaw was covered in a faint stubble. His deep eyes were traced with red bloodshot lines. Unlike his usual immaculate appearance, James right now looked like a man who had just dragged himself out of an exhausting battle just to find her. A wave of heartache surged, squeezing Diep's chest. She turned fully toward him, staring intently at his side profile. "James," she spoke. Her voice was small and trembling. "I'm listening." Diep bit her lower lip hard, her eyes burning. "I'm sorry." Her voice broke, melting into the soft music playing in the background. James frowned slightly. "Why are you apologizing?" James asked, his voice deep. "I left without a single word." Diep looked down, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket tightly. "I left you alone in silence. I cowardly ran away, making you suffer and search for me everywhere like this. I should have shared more with you. I shouldn't have made that decision on my own." She choked up, the tears she had held back for so long finally rolling down her cheeks. Hearing her self-blame, James's hand tightened on the steering wheel. He glanced quickly at Diep, his bloodshot eyes filled with ache. He reached out his right hand, covering her trembling hand entirely, wrapping it in his warmth. "You are not to blame at all. It was because of me that you had to suffer in silence, enduring all that humiliation from my father." His voice softened, incredibly gentle and full of healing power. "Please stop beating yourself up over it. The worst is over, Diep. The most important thing now is we are truly back together." Diep's tears fell freely, soaking a patch of the woolen blanket. James's warm words of comfort were like an antidote, wiping away all the guilt that had haunted her during her days away from him. She turned her hand, intertwining her fingers tightly with his rough ones. Diep bit her lower lip slightly, the insecurity deeply rooted in her subconscious, still not completely gone. "You suddenly dropped everything at the company to come find me. Chairman Hoan, he will definitely be furious. Will our decision today ruin all the hard work and dedication you've poured into everything?" Hearing that question, James sighed softly. He looked over at his little girl, His eyes were overflowing with a determination so fierce it could melt away any fear. "Diep, listen to me." James's voice was clear and steady, yet carried the weight of a vow. "The greatest life's work for me isn't the CEO chair. It's not the million-dollar contracts, nor is it that cold family empire. My greatest life's work is you and the little life growing day by day inside you." James paused for a beat, brought Diep's hand to his lips, and softly kissed her slender fingers. "When I was at death's door, you swallowed your pride and traded your own dignity to save my life. So now, when I am completely healthy, if I can't use these very hands to create a safe sky for you and our child, then what's the point of all this power I hold?" James's deep, sincere words seeped into every corner of Diep's wounded heart. A soothing silence enveloped the car. Every psychological burden was completely lifted. She slowly exhaled, leaning deeper into the leather seat. The car continued to speed down the moonlit road. A long while later, James's voice broke the silence again. "Diep, have you thought of a name for our baby yet?" The corners of Diep's lips stretched into a relieved smile. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "I haven't. What about you?" James smiled. "I was thinking, if it's a girl, I want to call her Jade, a little piece of precious jade. But if it's a boy, I'll name him Lucas." "Lucas?" "Yeah, in Latin it means bringer of light." James nodded. "Before, my life only revolved around financial reports and my father's absolute oppressive control. Numb, devoid of light. Since you came along and now our baby, I finally know what a family is. This child is like a beam of light cutting straight into that dark world, pulling me back from the edge of despair." Hearing those whispered words, Diep's heart melted. She gently intertwined her small fingers with his. "Lucas," Diep whispered, her voice dissolving into the quiet, poetic night. "I love that name, our Lucas." James smiled. He looked at her, his voice low. "Get some shut-eye. We still have a bit of a drive before we get home." Diep pulled the blanket up, obediently closing her eyes. The steady rhythm of the tires humming against the road quickly pulled her into a deep sleep. When Diep's breathing became even, the smile on James's lips slowly faded. His eyes hardened, cold and alert. A direct, uncompromising confrontation to protect this family was inevitable. But he was ready. The black SUV tore through the night, speeding toward the hill. A few quiet hours passed. The high-pressure lights of the highway gradually thinned out and receded far behind, giving way to the thick darkness and biting chill of the remote outskirts. The long journey had finally reached its last leg. The tires crunched onto the crushed gravel dirt path. The midnight mist, heavy with a chilling cold, hovered and draped over the quiet hill. The space was dead silent, save for the rhythmic chirping of insects. The bright moonlight pierced through the hazy fog, illuminating every detail of a sturdy oak cabin resting silently under the shadows of the trees. The headlights swept a long beam of light before snapping off as James hit the brakes, bringing the car to a halt. He looked over at the back seat. Diep's mother was still deep in an exhausted sleep. James couldn't bear to wake her. He gently shook Diep's shoulder, whispering, "Diep, we're home. Let's go down and unlock the door first, then we'll help your mom inside." Diep gave a small nod. The two of them stepped out of the car quietly. The air here was crisp and cold, carrying the fresh scent of young leaves. James wrapped his arm around Diep's back, resting his hand on her waist, guiding her steps over the uneven ground. Approaching the first wooden step leading to the porch, the corners of Diep's lips lifted slightly. Suddenly, James's footsteps halted. His heels froze hard against the wood. The hand resting on Diep's waist tightened abruptly. Diep could clearly hear James suck in a breath of freezing air through his teeth and hold it. Every muscle in his body went rigid like a guitar string about to snap. She looked up, following his gaze, under the dim yellow light of the porch. In the corner of the hallway, on a quiet rattan chair, someone was sitting. Chairman Hoan, wearing a dark gray wool trench coat, sat with his legs crossed. His back leaned fully against the chair, his hands resting comfortably on the woven rattan armrests. He was sitting there completely alone. His presence was utterly silent, without a single sound, yet it brought an incredibly suffocating pressure that crushed the entire poetic vibe of the moonlit night. On the small ebony tea table, a clay teapot was releasing thin wisps of smoke. Chairman Hoan reached out. His fingers lifted the porcelain teacup from its saucer. He brought it to his lips, taking a small sip. Then he slowly placed the cup back down. Clink. The sound of the porcelain base hitting the saucer rang out sharp and dry. He slowly raised his eyes. His cold gaze swept past James's rigid face. Then, moving slowly, that gaze locked directly onto Diep. A suffocating silence dragged on for several seconds. "The scenery here isn't bad," Chairman Hoan's voice rang out, deep, slow, but sharp as a razor. He tapped his index finger rhythmically against the rattan armrest. "But have you had enough of playing this trashy little family game, James?" James clenched his jaw, taking a half step forward. Instinctively, he pulled Diep back slightly behind him. Chairman Hoan didn't even bother looking at his son. His eyes remained locked onto Diep. The corners of his mouth curled into a bland, highly contemptuous smile. His arms slowly lifted, his index finger pointing straight at her. "You are very good." Chairman Hoan's voice hardened, every word dropping onto the wooden floor like boulders. "That contract you signed with me, you agreed to vanish from James's life forever. Why are you playing tricks now? Why did you seduce my son into neglecting the entire corporation, throwing away his entire future just to chase you to the middle of nowhere?" Chairman Hoan's degrading words felt like invisible knives slashing straight at Diep's pride. For so long, Diep had always chosen to shrink back. She felt insecure about her background, terrified of the ruthless power of this family, and always carried the guilt of being a burden. But tonight, looking up at the broad back of the man who had just exhausted himself looking for her, the man who was ready to throw away a CEO chair just to hold her. A fire suddenly ignited, burning away all the weakness in Diep's chest. The instinct to protect the man she loved, combined with the invisible strength of a mother-to-be, completely awakened her. Diep realized that if she kept stepping back and silently enduring the humiliation, she would never be worthy of James's sacrifices. This time, she couldn't just remain a fragile shadow hiding behind him anymore. Seeing Diep tremble slightly, James immediately took a long stride, intending to step up and shield her like always. But this time, Diep gently reached out, gripping his shirt firmly, holding him back. James froze, turning to look at her. Under the dim yellow light, he saw that Diep's small shoulders had stopped shaking. She slowly lowered her hands, which had been nervously clasped over her stomach. Diep took a deep breath, held her head high, and proactively took a step forward. Her usually clear, innocent eyes were now fierce, staring straight into the cold eyes of the powerful chairman without a hint of avoidance. "Sir." Diep's voice rang out incredibly clear and resolute, shattering the oppressive atmosphere he had just cast over them. "I agreed to that contract because I wanted to buy a chance at life for James, the very person you used as a pawn to blackmail me." Chairman Hoan's eyebrows twitched slightly. He seemingly didn't expect this timid little bunny to actually stand up straight and bite back. I really did plan to leave forever, Diep continued, each word spoken as if drawing out all the courage from the very bottom of her heart. But you underestimated James, and you underestimated me too. Love and sacrifice aren't lifeless contracts on a desk for you to weigh and measure. Hearing this, Chairman Juan let out a loud laugh, a dark, muddy laugh that echoed through the quiet night, carrying ultimate contempt. Love? Sacrifice? He tapped his fingers hard against the ebony tea table. Clack, clack. What kind of cheap play are you putting on here? Do you think your empty little speeches can stand against the empire I've spent my entire life building? Look at yourself. You dragged him down into the mud with you, made him abandon his entire family's life's work, and you call that love? Threats closed in from all sides, but Diep's eyes didn't waver. She leaned in slightly, proactively grabbing James's large hand, their fingers intertwining tightly. You're right. I don't have wealth or power. Diep looked straight at Chairman Juan, her voice ringing out stronger than ever. But I have something that you could never buy in your entire life, and that is a real family. You forced him to become a heartless machine, stripping away his right to live and be happy. You might be a great chairman in the business world, but as a father, you are a failure. The phrase, a failure as a father, hit Chairman Juan's pride like a bucket of ice water. His face instantly darkened. The hand tapping the table suddenly clenched into a fist. Shut your mouth, Chairman Juan growled, an aura of murder radiating clearly. But just before Chairman Juan's fury could explode, James squeezed Diep's hand, stepping up a half pace, completely merging his presence with hers. Their defensive wall was now rock solid, impenetrable. She is right, Dad, James spoke up. You can take it all back. The power, the money, the CEO title, or even my inheritance. Take it all. James looked directly into his father's eyes, speaking loudly and clearly. But you are not allowed to insult my woman. She didn't seduce me. I was the one who went crazy tearing the world apart to find her. James's eyes flashed with absolute determination. He continued, You always calculate every move to keep me under control. But there is one variable that your contract could never have accounted for. Chairman Juan's clenched fist froze. She is pregnant. James dropped the final blow, every word confidently hammered into the space between them. It's my flesh and blood. Dad, you're going to be a grandfather. The crickets in the mist suddenly went dead silent. The moonlight cast the couple's long shadows against the wooden wall, blanketing Chairman Juan's rattan chair. His gaze slowly moved from James's resolute face, sliding down to the stomach hidden beneath Diep's woolen sweater. The shock was clearly visible in the frown of the chairman, who always thought he held the sky in his hands. A terrifying silence descended, blotting out the clear night sky. Dear listeners, today's episode has closed on a suffocatingly silent note. After so many storms, Diep is finally no longer a weak shadow who only knows how to endure and run away. Her clapback today wasn't driven by impulsiveness, but by the strength and sacred instinct of a mother protecting her home. At the same time, James's ironclad declaration has officially pushed the conflict between father and son to an irreversible breaking point. Faced with his very own family's flesh and blood, how will a cold-blooded man who always prioritizes power and control like Chairman Juan react? Will this little life be a bridge to heal the rift, or will it become the catalyst for an even more brutal war over custody? Leave your thoughts and predictions down in the comments section below. If today's story brought you a lot of emotions, please take a moment to hit the like button and share this video. Don't forget to click subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next developments in our upcoming videos. Thank you all for always taking the time to listen. Goodbye, and see you next time.